Hello, my name is Jello Biafra. I am being held at peer pressure point in a phone booth in Lexington to tell you that Lexington's hardest show in their own opinion that you'll ever love, in their own opinion, that's all of you, but not me. They wrote it on a napkin for me, is Brains on Film. That's what you're watching, or you wouldn't hear this in the first place, would you? Support free TV. Start your own TV station. Pirate TV. There's 70 pirate stations in Rome alone. Do it. Do it. Just say no to Jesse Helms. Burn his dick in every way you know how. Brains on Film, or you lose.
Let's hear some music! I said, let's hear some music!
I don't know. You have to understand this is pre-Wayne's World, pre-Mystery Science Theater, pre-Comedy Central, pre-Jackass, pre-any sort of gonzo entertainment that now exists. And I mean, YouTube, come on. Had someone tried to explain what the fuck a YouTube would be in 1989 to a couple punks sitting around in the middle of Kentucky watching bad movies, we would have looked at them, eyes glazed over, drooling, before we slapped them in the face with a fucking VHS tape and screamed about how Blockbuster Video was running the drive-in out of business. I mean, normal people couldn't make a TV show. There was no system for it. So we used what we had. Some cheap cameras, a really terrible public access channel, and the balls to try it. And a lot of beer.
I'm George Moranville, a.k.a. Brother George, and I was a co-host on the show Brains on Film.
Or the town drunk.
Oh, I had to grab me a biscuit.
I'm going to be falling on my face, man.
Brains on Film was our way of discussing movies that sometimes people didn't discuss, or movies that people discussed, but they discussed them in the wrong way. And I'm sort of a pretentious side of that by my own admission as far as the show goes.
This is the harbinger of the modern day horror film. I mean, the 50s had kind of the anti-communist kind of themes with the black and white films of invasion of you know,
whatever,
red,
the doo-doo heads, whatever.
Right. In the 60s, we had kind of a dual thing. We had the Corman films, which were, you know, ours. We could thankfully say that we own Roger Corman. America does. But we also had the Hammer films from Europe. But the 70s, when the 70s came in, this film just blew people away.
That's right. We'll say not only a harbinger of horror films, but exploitation films, pretty much all the alternative filmmaking going on. This thing got everybody's mouth watering.
Well, there's a documentary feel to this film that I think was unheard of until Tobe Hooper did it. Tobe Hooper directed this film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In 1973, he directed it.
My role was to overanalyze, which I'm guilty as charged, on films, no matter whether they were pretentious films that we were trying to dumb down or whether they were dumb films we were trying to show the strong points of.
I am the product of a lifetime of a fanboy who showed horror movies in his mother's sewing room on 8mm Hammer horror movies. To present day, I am the professor who teaches a horror seminar at the University of Kentucky. Susan Sontag had written the essay, Notes on Camp. Quentin Tarantino hadn't come along yet, and there was still this sort of nervous tension between high art and low art, or the brows, as I call them, highbrow, middle brow, low brow, unibrow.
Anyway.
I guess we'll drop a clip in there.
Yeah.
The crowd would gather at the temple for the great feast, the blood feast that would give the goddess to the people. The young priestesses would be slaughtered on the great altar. Their blood would be caught in silver bowls as it ran from their bodies. Then certain organs and limbs would be removed and prepared as dishes to serve the people.
Oh, keep talking to me, Fuad.
As a cultural and a social event, where all my friends would get together. We were all in graduate school in English. And this is another thing about the cultural anxiety, because I'm trying to study film as art, but I love film as shit too. And I'm trying to pull these things together and the way that they intersect. And it was almost like on Saturday, I mean, in antediluvian time, when if you wanted to watch something, you had to be there when it was aired. And if you didn't, you missed it, which is something I don't think younger people will ever even understand growing up under those kind of the discipline of that. And we'd get together every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock to watch Pee-wee's Playhouse. And we'd get together whenever it was. I mean, it was a little more erratic on local access, but we'd find out when the thing was on, and we'd be there for it, and we'd build kind of a party around it, and we'd integrate it into our culture. That's another important thing about it. I think it wasn't something that was inaccessible. It was just a bunch of schmoes just like you. Who were even younger. And so when they were sneering at stuff, we could sneer at them. And off in the heavens somewhere, Jack Kerouac's sneering at all of us. And it's a big sneerathon all around.
Try to tell us, Tony.
No, sir. I can't remember. Everything happened so bad.
I'm Larry Joe Treadway. And in Brains on Film, I played a guy very similar to myself, known as Professor Tread.
Contemporary hero of Brother George.
As I was saying, I'm not going to go out on a tangent.
Damn! I guess my love of like bad movies probably goes back first of all to like the idea of bad movies, because before I actually probably saw a horror movie in the real sense, I saw Famous Monsters magazine, Castle of Frankenstein, Creepy, those kind of things at like the drugstores in Georgetown, Kentucky. Georgetown, Kentucky, which 15 miles from Lexington, but in like the 60s and 70s, it could have been 100 miles because totally repressed. The Baptist College ran the whole town. There had once been a downtown movie theater. It went out of business because the college didn't like the kind of movies that were shown. The drive-ins were 15 miles away at the time in Lexington, and we'd make regular trips on the weekends to see whatever was popular, sometimes things that weren't popular or inappropriate. Like me and my cousins, we got piled in the car with my mom, and we go to the family drive-in, which was up on New Circle Road. There was the Circle 25, and across the street was the family. We went to the family one like weeknight during the summer, and it was a film called Dirty O'Neill, which I'm sure was a Dirty Harry ripoff, Clint Eastwood ripoff. And of course the opening scene is like they're at like this, I think a police officer's birthday party, and then they wheel out, you know, a big tiered cake, and a totally naked girl jumps out of the top, and the camera goes to like full on, as close up to like bouncing boobs as you could ever get. And it was like me and my cousin were just like, okay, drive-ins are the greatest thing ever in the history of the world. And it kind of stuck.
Sometimes they're weird.
Whitney, I'm a police officer.
Sometimes they're ugly. But sometimes the biggest problems are the prettiest.
We'll follow you, and we'll get you sooner or later. So you might as well give in right now. Take off your gun coats.
Dirty O'Neill, the cleanest cop in town.
The idea of doing a movie review show was initially my idea. And I went to Tread and I said, here's my idea. And he completely jumped in. So creative force behind the show, I have to say, was He and I and nobody else. I think I was the production head behind it because I worked in production. He was sort of the creative director, creative designer. So I have to say, I could easily sit down in front of a camera and get really drunk and talk about movies. I think overall, the whole look of the show and everything and the whole look of the promotion of the show was all him. Because I was very, very sort of empty about that. Every once in a while, he would create this amazing poster, and I'd go, oh, that's great. And he'd go, dude, what do I have to do to get a compliment out of you? This is fucking amazing. And I would go, oh shit, that's fucking incredible. So those things hold up like Black Flag, posters. The creative force behind the show was equally 50-50 for sure. But I think if I would have approached anybody else and said, hey, let's do a show reviewing movies, it would have never turned out like this.
We considered ourselves punk rock and underground, so it just made sense that we would promote what it was we were doing just like we were a punk rock band. And in essence, really, truly making a television show then when there was no YouTube, there were no digital cameras, there was no digital editing suite, everything was analog. The equipment, really good equipment, was way expensive, so we didn't have any of that. Doing a show like that was like having a garage band. We had 3 guys that helped us, and George and I just wrote the bad songs that were Brains on Film. That's the way I look at it.
And the way they promoted it, it was like a punk band too. They'd have all these posters put up on utility poles all around South Limestone, which we used to call Slimestone. And it just became a part of the punk culture, just like Bradley's Club or anything else. I mean, that was an interesting time in Lexington, and those guys were sort of the super low rent basement media version of a lot of other really cool things that were happening in Lexington in the late 80s.
George and I weren't in the scene in Lexington. We had not been members of T13, which was kind of the underground punk group of dudes. I loved to go to those shows and everything, but I wasn't friends with those guys. They didn't know me, I didn't know them. So we were definitely wanting to attract the attention of the people that we considered in the know in Lexington, the cool people, because we weren't those cool people.
Brother George was more of the sort of erudite reading film comment magazine, studying film, and Tread was more pretty straightforward about, look, this is what we're doing. These are low budget films. So I would try to sort of elevate them to a higher level, and he would take them as what they were. But at the same time, he would throw in some quip that was much smarter than I would ever thought of, which made me the stooge, which sort of ended up being sort of the gist of the show.
Texas is pretty much the serial killer capital of the world.
Without a doubt.
Even though California wants to be, California likes to run around saying, oh, well, we had more murders than you, but the guys in Texas go, oh, yeah? But all ours were committed by one guy.
That's right.
There was a certain amount of wrestling to our show because people couldn't tell if we really liked each other or not, or whether we really agreed on things or not. So there was a bit of heat, as they say, that people interpreted between us that may or may not have existed. And I can't say that it did or didn't, but it was super fucking fun.
I gotta say, we always wanted to be funny. We did take it seriously as far as talking about the films and wanting the films to seem more important than anything. Because, I mean, we started doing Brains on Film because we loved the movies. I mean, that was the real impetus behind it. But of course, we thought we were fucking funny. So there's a lot of inside jokes, a lot of stupid humor, and a lot of SCTV-inspired nonsense, a lot of envelope pushing.
Homophobia, according to our friend Mr. Webster, is a fear or hatred of homosexuals or homosexuality, for those of you out there. And I think this is going to be a good show because this is going to help the homosexual community come to grips with a couple of mainstream films that may or may not be good, but they dealt with their lifestyle. And for those homophobics out there, you know, they can take a look at their own insecurities and their own psychoses and kind of deal with it themselves.
We're basically showing these to let you know that, yes, there are some mainstream films out there who deal with an alternative lifestyle.
That's what I like to refer to as alternative lifestyle.
The essential paradox of Brains on Film is that on the one side, they were never afraid to be sophomoric, scatological, adolescent, pure real. But on the other hand, they dared you to call them pretentious, and they were going to provide some information, and they were going to give you the content, the critical context. So to me, that's the best of all possible worlds. It's goofy, but it's informed.
I think the moment that I realized that it was a real show, that people watched, was when I was at a family reunion and a guy was going, "You got to see this show on channel 12 or whatever channel it was." I don't remember. "Man, these guys are doing this and this and this." And I go, "That's me." Like, the guy had no idea it was me. And I'm like, okay, so, and then the other thing was somebody come up and going, "You look taller on TV." And I thought, that's when I know we're characters. That's when I know, people don't just, but at the same time, you would go to a bar and someone would walk up and go, "Hey, motherfucker, don't make fun of Al Pacino in Cruising."
There are some very, very funny scenes in this film. There are.
Leather-clad revelers having just a big old time in there.
But we did have complete interactive shit going on.
So yeah, it was kind of weird being out there in the sense that we put the P.O. box address on every show so people could write or send things. And then we would actually respond back with Brains on Film notepads and postcards and just general stuff about the show to kind of make it look like a bigger deal than maybe it was.
I guess we need to close out. We need to talk about notepads and stereo.
One more time.
Notepads.
I don't know whether to call it fan mail, but I guess if you don't have any other word for it, it was a little above general correspondence. Again, you got to keep in mind, there was no such thing as email.
Well, due to some of the mail we've received, I'm not sure if you'll be here.
Your Brains on Film. I've been watching your show for quite some time and have finally come to a conclusion, not about the show, but about why I watch. It's not out of sheer boredom. I'm bored all the time. It's certainly not because there is nothing else on television. Oh shit, I forgot to capitalize television.
Trying to keep up with the Joneses, wouldn't you say? Not the Johnsons, but the
Joneses. They was wanting to having a real Egyptian feast. They was wanting to have Fuad Ramses come on in and do that Ishtar bullshit.
Sometimes the lovely ladies would chime in.
Think I'm funny?
All I want for Christmas is Professor Tread. I'll be naughty or nice. What does he want?
Santa Claus only brings presents to them that's been good all year.
When I go back through the archives of everything we achieved, all the awards, all the accolades, all of the constant talk about Brains on Film, this might be my favorite note ever. If ever in my life I saw a couple of faggots, you guys are it. Your program should be called Fag on Film.
Which is an interesting sort of poetic phrasing of, I would have preferred Sharpie, you two are fags. But that was pretty interesting, that they took the time to stamp a letter and send it to us to tell us that we're the gayest people they've ever seen.
So yeah, that guy, again, while we're breaking ground, this guy was a YouTube commenter before there was a YouTube.
As with many things, Brains on Films was prescient, I think, of the culture and the technology to come and the way those intersect.
Or
it's like a forerunner of what people are doing on YouTube all the time. Viral culture. It's like technology in general. I used to think that Brains on Film was like Videodrome, that it was like this sort of toxic systemic virus which was transmitted through the public access channel. And if that's the case, then maybe it led to YouTube.
I know this sounds incredibly pretentious, but George and I were always ahead of what was getting ready to happen. Whether it was with Brains on Film and public access, which eventually became streaming audio and video, or whether it was Film Cynics and the radio show being kind of the precursor to podcast. And even when we ended Brains on Film, the natural progression was to become a punk band. And with Ted Bundy's Volkswagen, I think we were on the cusp of grunge and all of that happening, and noise rock and all of that happening. If anything, we were almost too informed for our own good. We were out there pushing the envelope and breaking the ground, trying to get something done when there was no mechanism yet to do these kind of things. You know, we suffer for being, premature ejaculators.
It was the best time I've ever had. Brains on Film was the most creative I've ever felt because it happened spontaneously. It didn't happen with a sense of what anybody else was going to say about editing it or cutting it apart. We didn't really care. We didn't really care. And that was, I think, what Tread and I were doing with everything we did, which was the band, whether it was the band or whether it was this show. Definitely it was the best, most free I ever felt with regard to expressing myself.
I think it's crucial when you're talking about cult phenomena to think about how self-conscious the artifact is. By which I mean that I don't think a couple of rich young film school graduates can make a cult film deliberately. A cult film needs to be accidental. This goes back to Susan Sontag again, Notes on Camp. And to really be cult, it needs to fail, which also fits in with the punk rock aesthetic, which I think is this weird sort of reverse snobbery at some point, which is if your band gets big enough to get outside of your brother's garage, then you've sold out. And I'm proud to say that Brains on Film never suffered that embarrassment. It failed flat out, and it failed to the extent that it's a great thing. There's a wonderful legacy to it that way. You need to fail on your own terms.
George, this is George. Just wanted to leave a message telling you that you are definitely the biggest geek in the world. Just testing the machine. See you, George. Talk to you.
Good evening, Brains on Film viewers. Thanks for calling. Thanks for watching. I got to make this short and sweet because this machine won't take a long message, as I found out before, but it will take a long one from you. So talk about whatever you want to talk about. Say something funny. Say something witty. If you got enough brain power. Bye.
Hi, this is Lauren, Jennifer, and we love your show, so give us a call at 266-9505. Bye.
Just finished watching the show. I loved it. It was much better than Cats. I'm going to see it again and again and again.
That was good. What'd you think? You're unhappy?
No.
You happy? Okay.
Have I ever been happy? Once?
No, you never have. But that was good. I thought that was a good show. I see my tally like.